January 17th, 1945. Western Germany, the Eiffel Forest. The snow fell silently through skeletal branches, each flake settling on the frozen earth like ash from a burned world. Along the muddy road that wound through the Hürtgen darkness, a convoy of American trucks ground forward, their engines coughing white exhaust into the bitter cold. Inside the canvas-covered beds, huddled together against the January wind, sat 37 women in Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. Their faces were pale, not merely from cold, but from something deeper, a terror they had been taught to expect, prepared to endure, promised would come. They were Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications auxiliaries, captured during the final German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, and they were certain, with the absolute conviction that ideology breeds, that they were being driven toward their destruction. The youngest was 19, the oldest 42. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. For years, the Reich's propaganda machine had filled their minds with specific, lurid images of what happened to German women who fell into enemy hands. The Bolsheviks were animals, they had been told, and the Americans, those mongrel democracies, were barely better. Rassenschande, racial defilement. The word had been repeated so often it had become a prophecy, a certainty, an inevitability. Some of these women carried cyanide capsules sewn into their uniform hems. Others had already whispered final prayers. They expected humiliation. They expected violence. They expected to be paraded through streets, stripped of dignity before being stripped of everything else. This is what they had been prepared for. This is what National Socialism had taught them to anticipate from the degenerate, decadent West. They were wrong. To understand the magnitude of what these women expected, one must first understand the architecture of fear that the Third Reich had constructed in the German mind. By 1945, the Nazi propaganda apparatus under Joseph Goebbels had spent 12 years systematically dehumanizing the enemy, particularly the Western Allies. The Americans were portrayed as a bastardized nation, a racial chaos of Jews, Negroes, and criminals held together only by materialistic greed. Roosevelt was a puppet. Eisenhower, they claimed, was a Swedish Jew. The American soldier was depicted as uncultured, brutal, motivated only by plunder and lust. Film reels shown across Germany portrayed American troops committing atrocities, fabrications designed to stiffen resistance and justify total war. Der Stürmer and Das Schwarze Korps ran illustrations of American soldiers assaulting German women, the imagery deliberate and graphic. The message was clear: surrender meant dishonor worse than death. For women serving in the Wehrmacht's auxiliary services, the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, this propaganda carried additional weight. Over 500,000 German women served in various capacities by war's end: signals operators, searchlight crews, administrative staff, and anti-aircraft auxiliaries. They were not officially soldiers, but they wore uniforms, took orders, and operated within military structures. They were close enough to combat to be captured, yet their status was ambiguous. Would they be treated as soldiers, as civilians, or as something else entirely? Spoils of war, objects to be used and discarded? The uncertainty itself was a weapon. Many women in uniform were issued explicit instructions: if capture was imminent, destroy documents, then destroy yourself. Some did. In March 1945, near Remagen, 3 female signals operators committed suicide rather than face capture by advancing American forces. Their bodies were found with their code books burned and their wrists opened. The fear was real. The fear was cultivated. The fear was the point. The truck stopped at a processing camp near Aachen. The women were ordered out. This was the moment they had been warned about, prepared for, dreaded. They climbed down into the mud, their legs numb, their hearts hammering. American soldiers, large men in olive drab, rifles slung casually across their backs, stood watching. The women bunched together instinctively, seeking protection in proximity, some placing themselves in front of younger girls. A lieutenant approached, his breath fogging in the cold. He was young himself, perhaps 24, with the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much Hurtgen, too much Ardennes, too much death. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he spoke in broken German, his accent thick, but his words clear. "You are safe. No one will hurt you. You will be treated with respect." They did not believe him. How could they? Words were cheap. Actions would reveal the truth. They were herded, gently, but herded nonetheless, toward a cluster of wooden barracks that had once housed German forces. Inside, the building was drafty but dry, heated by 2 potbelly stoves that glowed red in the dim light. The women were told to wait. They waited. Minutes passed like hours. Then the door opened again, and American military policemen entered, but not alone. With them were 2 Red Cross nurses, both women, and a U.S. Army chaplain. The nurses carried blankets and boxes marked with red crosses. The chaplain carried a Bible and a tired smile. What happened next defied everything these women had been taught to expect. They were separated, not for interrogation through violence, but by rank and age for administrative processing. Those who were wet and shivering were given dry uniforms, American uniforms, sizes approximate, but clean and warm. Those who were hungry were fed hot soup, bread, margarine, and coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute Germany had been drinking for 3 years. The warmth of the liquid in their throats was a small miracle. And then, most astonishing of all, they were escorted in small groups to a bathhouse. Inside, wooden partitions had been erected, creating individual stalls. Soap was provided, towels were provided, hot water, precious, and rationed even for American troops, was provided. And then the American soldiers left. The nurses remained outside the door, offering assistance if needed, but the men withdrew completely. The women were allowed to bathe in private, in privacy. Dignity, that abstract thing they had been told to abandon, was being handed back to them by the very enemy who was supposed to destroy it. One of the women, whose diary would later be discovered in U.S. Army archives, wrote, "We washed ourselves and wept. We did not understand. We had been told they were beasts, but they gave us soap." This was not an isolated incident. It was policy. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, to which the United States was a signatory, prisoners of war were entitled to humane treatment regardless of gender. But the American military went beyond mere legal obligation, particularly regarding women. The U.S. War Department had issued explicit directives concerning the treatment of female POWs, emphasizing that German and Japanese propaganda would seize upon any misconduct to fuel resistance. More than that, there was a cultural element, a deep-seated American ideal, imperfect in practice but powerful in principle, that women were to be protected, not exploited. This was not chivalry in the medieval sense. It was something more pragmatic and more profound. It was a manifestation of the values the war was ostensibly being fought to defend: individual dignity, rule of law, and the fundamental humanity of every person, even the enemy. Records from SHAF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, document the processing of over 11,000 female German prisoners between January and May 1945. Standard protocol included immediate separation from male POWs, medical examinations conducted only by female personnel when available, private sleeping quarters, and strict enforcement of non-fraternization rules. Violations were rare, and when they occurred, they were prosecuted. In March 1945, 2 American soldiers were court-martialed and imprisoned for making unwanted advances toward female prisoners at a camp in France. The message was unmistakable. The rule of law applied, even in war, even toward the enemy, even when no one was watching. For the German women experiencing this treatment, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed about the American enemy, was collapsing under the weight of lived reality. The Americans were not monsters. They were tired young men who shared their cigarettes, who showed photographs of their own sisters and mothers, who treated the captured women not as objects of conquest but as human beings caught in the machinery of war. The contrast was unbearable. If the Americans were not what they had been told, what else was a lie? If the enemy showed mercy, what did that say about the Reich that had shown none? The symbolic object in this story is soap. Simple, utilitarian, mundane soap. To the women in that Aachen camp, it represented something far larger than cleanliness. In Germany by 1945, soap had become a luxury. Rationing had reduced household soap to a coarse, gritty substance that barely lathered, and even that was scarce. To be given real soap, American soap that smelled faintly of lavender and glycerin, was to be given a piece of abundance, a tangible proof that the American war machine was not struggling, not starving, not desperate. Germany had told its people that the Allies were on the verge of collapse, that their economies were crumbling, that their soldiers were demoralized. But here was soap. Enough soap to give to prisoners, enough hot water to let enemies bathe in privacy. This was not the war effort of a dying nation. This was the surplus of a society so rich, so secure, that it could afford generosity even toward those who had wished it dead. That soap passed from American hands to German was a message more powerful than any propaganda leaflet. We do not need to humiliate you to prove we have won. We have already won. Our victory is so complete that we can afford to be kind. As the days turned into weeks, the women were moved to larger POW camps, eventually to facilities in France and later to holding areas in Britain. The conditions varied. Some camps were better than others, some officers more humane, but the fundamental policy remained consistent. They were fed, they were housed, they were treated, in the dry language of military reports, in accordance with international law and American values. Many were put to work, laundry, clerical tasks, agricultural labor, but they were paid in camp currency and given rest periods. They received mail from home when postal systems allowed. They were given medical care. When the Red Cross visited, the reports filed back to Geneva noted that conditions for female German POWs in American custody met or exceeded convention standards, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the women began to change. Not all of them. Some remained committed Nazis until the end, their ideology too deeply rooted to be shaken by mere kindness. But others began to question. They began to compare the rhetoric they had been fed with the reality they were living. One woman, interviewed by US intelligence officers in April 1945, stated, "I was told that Americans hate Germans, but the nurse who treated my frostbite stayed late to make sure the bandages were clean. I do not understand hate that does this." The transformation was not immediate, it was not universal, but it was real, and it was documented. US Army psychological warfare units studied the phenomenon, noting that female POWs were among the most effective sources of counter-propaganda when repatriated. Their testimony, quiet, personal, undeniable, did more to undermine faith in the Nazi regime than 1,000 leaflets. They had been promised humiliation and received respect. The dissonance was a crack in the wall of ideology, and through that crack, doubt flooded in. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The women began the slow process of repatriation, returning to a Germany that no longer existed, to cities reduced to rubble, to families scattered or dead, to a nation beginning the long, agonizing process of reckoning with what it had done and what had been done to it. Many of the women never spoke publicly about their time as prisoners, Shame, complicated and layered, kept them silent, not shame for how they were treated, but shame for what they had believed, for what they had supported, for the years they had spent serving a regime that had lied to them about everything, even the nature of their enemies. But some did speak. In the 1950s and 60s, as West Germany began the painful process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, a few former Wehrmacht-Helferinnen gave interviews to historians and journalists. They spoke of their capture with a mixture of relief and confusion. They spoke of the soap. They spoke of the privacy. They spoke of the American soldiers who, instead of being the savages they had been warned about, were boys from Kansas and Ohio who were homesick and kind. One woman, in a 1967 interview, said, "I expected wolves. I met men. That was the beginning of my understanding that we had been the wolves all along." There is a photograph, archived now in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, taken in February 1945 at a POW processing center in Belgium. It shows a group of female German prisoners standing outside a barracks wrapped in US Army blankets, holding tin cups of coffee. Their faces are visible, unobscured, free of the terror that had gripped them days before. One woman is almost smiling, not with joy, but with the tentative relief of someone who has discovered that the nightmare they feared is not coming true. Behind them, an American soldier stands guard, his rifle pointed at the ground, his posture relaxed. He's not a conqueror, gloating over the defeated. He's simply a man doing his duty in a war that is almost over, in a world that is already beginning to think about what comes after. That photograph is the story. Not the battles, not the strategy, not the grand narratives of armies and nations, but the small, quiet moment when one human being looked at another and chose mercy over cruelty, dignity over degradation, law over vengeance. It is a moment that should have been ordinary, but in the context of total war was extraordinary. It was a moment when democracy, that abstract and often disappointing ideal, proved itself not through rhetoric, but through action, through soap and privacy and hot water, and respect given freely to those who did not expect it and had not earned it by any logic, except the logic of shared humanity. The women who were captured in January 1945 had been prepared for humiliation. They had been taught to expect savagery. They had been told that surrender was a fate worse than death. And when they were proven wrong, when they were given blankets instead of blows, privacy instead of parade, respect instead of rape, the foundations of their world shifted. Not all of them could accept it. Not all of them wanted to. But the evidence was undeniable, written on their skin in the warmth of clean water, tasted in the bitterness of real coffee, felt in the simple, radical act of being seen as human by an enemy who had every reason, every justification, every opportunity to do otherwise. This is the truth that history sometimes forgets in its focus on battles and borders, that wars are fought not only with weapons but with principles, and that the character of a nation is revealed not in how it treats its allies, but in how it treats its prisoners. The United States in 1945 was not perfect. Its own soil still bore the stain of segregation and injustice. Its hands were not clean. But in those camps, in those cold barracks in the winter of 1945, it offered something that totalitarianism could never offer, the possibility of mercy without weakness, strength without cruelty, victory without dehumanization. The women returned to Germany carrying that truth with them, whether they spoke it aloud or kept it silent in their hearts. And in the ruins of the Reich, as the lies crumbled and the reckoning began, that truth became a small light in a very dark place, a reminder that even in the depths of the worst war humanity had ever known, there were still those who chose to see the enemy as human, who gave soap when they could have given suffering, who offered privacy when they could have imposed humiliation. That choice, quiet and unheralded, was as much a victory as any won on any battlefield. It was the victory of civilization over barbarism, of law over lawlessness, of the fragile, imperfect, necessary belief that every person, even the enemy, even the defeated, even those who wore the uniform of evil, possesses a dignity that cannot be taken, only recognized or denied. And on a cold January day in 1945, in the mud and snow of a broken continent, a handful of American soldiers chose to recognize it. That is the story. That is the truth. That is what freedom, in its finest and most demanding form, actually looks like.